These videos are not regular how-to videos for amateur artists, nor are they art history. Their great strength lies in their breadth and the serious overarching message to professional painters, art historians, amateur artists, museum people, and anyone interested in art in general and representational art in particular. They're an impassioned plea to all defenders of representational art not to throw the baby out with the bathwater by only going back to the Renaissance way of doing things, ignoring the stunning contribution the Boston School painters and men like John Sargent made to its brilliant evolution. What they achieved by combining good draftsmanship and painterly impressionistic seeing with Monet's startling revelations in the use of full-spectrum color should not be dismissed as mere Victorian sentimentality, but revered, studied, and learned from for its stunning visual qualities, giving the art of representational painting new powers and bringing it to new heights. Well, look at the attendance here today. Thank you very much for coming in. This is part 2 of the Boston School. And my name is Paul Ingbretson. I'm going to be taking you on a tour, five performances here in the Groton Public Library. And by the way, I do want to thank, more than anything else, the Tarbell Trust and the Groton Public Library for making this possible, for making the videos possible. I'm really looking forward to what this does to support the Boston School, which, by the way, has, in some sense, its continuation here in Groton through R.H. Ives Gamble, who is my mentor in the Boston School. So it's very exciting to be able to present the underlying information regarding the influences that made the Boston School what it is. And so today we're doing Vermeer, and so I brought this, actually, I'm going to read a little bit out of this. I wasn't planning to, but I'm going to read just a little bit for a couple seconds. Philip Hale was one of the 5 teachers at the museum school that make up, actually, the Boston School itself. The Boston School wasn't the museum school, but Edmund Tarbell headed up the museum school, and he was the dean of what they call the Boston School, which is a way of thinking and a method of painting. All right, but let me just share with you this. Let's get on to Vermeer. Let me just share with you what Philip Hale, who in some cases, by the way, is thought of as the least of these of the Boston School painters in terms of his performance. But as I think Gamble used to say, that he was Gamble, by the way, was Robert Hale Ives Gamble. So Philip Hale, relative, he said Hale's always had something about writing going on, and so he had a sort of a split focus. Nevertheless, so Philip Hale wrote the first really serious book on Vermeer, and him being a painter makes it uniquely valuable to us as painters. And I'll say one more thing, and that is that this whole presentation is not a history. It's a visual assessment of the Boston School. And so what we're talking about now with the influences visually, what happens, listen to this though, and you can see what the importance of this is, at least in Hale's eyes. Chapter 1, The Art of Jan Vermeer. We find the best men by a process of elimination. At the outset, it may seem strange to call Vermeer the greatest painter who ever lived. Yet, if one looks at painting from the realistic standpoint, one of necessity arrives at something like this idea. One may readily conceive that Titian and Giorgione were more seductive artistic personalities, that Da Vinci was more subtle, Raphael a greater draftsman. But when it comes to sheer, downright painting, it would seem that Vermeer was in most respects the leader of all. Indeed, it might almost be said that from our ultra-modern point of view, till Vermeer painted, no one had tried to paint at all. Of course, there were giants like Velázquez, Rubens, and Rembrandt who did very wonderful things. But none of these conceived of arriving at tone by an exquisitely just relation of color values, and it is this idea that lies at the root of all really good modern painting. It's true that Vermeer seems himself to have tried to come at a certain tonality by underpainting in blue. Still, compared to any other old master, his sense of color values, the relation of various tints and hues, one with another, seems to have been exquisitely acute. This, and the manner in which he studied the edges of objects, a subject which is discussed in another chapter, are the two chief qualities which lead to his preeminence as a painter. They may not seem to the lay mind very important qualities, but it's not claimed that Vermeer is an important painter from the layman's point of view. Rather, it's asserted that to other painters, Vermeer seems very great, perhaps the greatest per se who has ever lived. What a place to start, huh? So let me just now, Philip Hale. This entire lecture is called Chromatic Chiaroscuro. Now, chiaroscuro was an invention of Da Vinci. I should say an invention, but it was an observation of Da Vinci about the visual world. That's in the clear and obscure. That's the lost and found. That's the things in the light show form. Everything that you use in painting is really, for example, if you can see it, if it's in the light, you can see it, and it's assumed that that's where all the attention will go. And yet, there's this very important part, which is the atmospheric shadow, the lost areas that we like to talk about. Philip Hale, in this volume, and I'm going to quote him several times in one place at length, what the unwary call atmosphere in an interior is really its coloristic light and shade. It's chromatic chiaroscuro. We'll break that down. All right, so on the left, you'll see Paxton. Paxton almost literally imitated Vermeer in his look. Paxton, by the way, was a consultant with Hale when writing this book on Vermeer. But I think he took the lessons considerably more to heart and was literally painting what people would say, by the way, one of the critics of the day said to be near Vermeer is to be mere veneer. And Paxton didn't seem to mind too much, but his way of working is considerably closer and his literal look is considerably more alike. And so I use him here on the first slide. Side by side, Vermeer on the right, Paxton on the left. This is the Boston School, and I'm showing you slides that give you some idea of the way they're being affected. You see, these has atmospheric elements to them, use of light, full color. Paxton on the left, again, this is very atmospheric, and this is an unfortunate reproduction. It's hard to get a really good reproduction of that one on the left. Philip Hale, that picture there is probably as near to the look of Vermeer as he ever gets. And so there's a typical sort of Victorian era scene. Benson in the middle to Kamp on the right, and then Tarbell. You can see the leftward light in the Tarbell actually, classically what the studio that belonged to Vermeer. Now, so let's just talk for a second though about the background. Again, you're talking Hals, Rubens, and Rembrandt as the as the early guys, the guys right before Vermeer. So this is the background in which he's working. Rubens in the middle, obviously, is he something more like, we think of almost like a cartoonist. He's inventing his figures, and he brings them a whole sort of quality that's, I guess you could say untrue. It's just that he's trying to create a world of his own, separate. So that's something that very strongly influences the arts. But the Dutch typically weren't that way. So you see Rembrandt to the right, and this is realism, down. And by the way, his sense of expression, I don't think anybody in history has ever, used expression like Rembrandt. And then Frans Hals, this is simply slice of life looking. A little bit from an earlier era. It doesn't have yet the full influence of a Velázquez, or I shouldn't say that because Velázquez is actually the same time. But nevertheless, that look and the one on the right are more typical of Dutch, the realistic tendencies. Specifically, Gerard Dow, by the way, was an enormously successful painter, 20 years younger, I guess, than Vermeer and the other painters I'm about to show you. And what was interesting about Vermeer, about Gerard Dow, is that he made a lot of money. He was a really wealthy painter. And so all the young artists were coming up and imitating him. And you're going to see Vermeer, oddly, doing the same sorts of things. The big hanging tapestries. And by the way, some of this is just showing the wealth of a nation at that time. The whole world of the Dutch at that time was really opulent. So the image on the left, you're going to see a Vermeer with a guy looking at his, geographer, whatever, looking at his maps. You're going to see women pouring. You're going to see, every single one of these things could be said to be a Vermeer. The influence of this Gerard Dow, because of his financial success, was enormous. He wasn't the teacher of I take that back. I'm sorry. He was a factor in Vermeer's actual development. But that's not my point here. De Hooch, Ter Borch, and Steen were literally side by side with Vermeer at the time, though. These are his contemporaries. All of them, of course, influenced by Dow. You'll see the feeling of all these guys there. Now, remember, this is slice of life stuff, and we're gonna see more about that in a second. But these are the big names of the time. There were 4 or 5 or more others that all of whom were very pretentious painters, skillful. This era resembles Paris at a later time. It resembles Italy at an earlier time. So there you are. I'm showing you down below the various, I forget which of these Vermeer ones is the geographer and which is the astronomer or whatever. But I wanted to show you a different influence. Because one of the differences, the key difference between Vermeer and all these other guys is the sense of what I'm going to call the architectonic. That's a word you probably won't have recognized, but that's that sensibility in a picture of verticals and horizontals and the feeling of organization in an architectural kind of a sense. None of the other guys, and I'm going to go back for a second, look at this, the sort of rowdy wildness of these things. They seem to almost have no moorings from the point of view of verticals and horizontals of architectural sense. Even Gerard Dow, who's even weirder than these guys, this stuff just wanders and flies around. Of course, it doesn't help that he's got an arching top in his studio that he keeps bringing into the picture. So nevertheless, here, let's get on to this. But who does? Who has that look? Well, earlier, by quite a bit, is Hans Holbein, the German painter. And that's the nearest thing we have to suggest where Vermeer's influences came from in that direction. However, and so that's a factor. However, that isn't the greatest influence on the Boston School. So here's Jan Vermeer. These are some of the most well-known pictures. There's the artist in the studio painting. Some of us think that isn't the way he painted, but you can see like the beginning of a painting, and it looks like he's drawn an outline and is filling it on from left to right. And we don't know that he didn't actually do that, but even Philip Hale, and after his studies, argues that that probably isn't what he did. So nevertheless, there's Jan Vermeer at the top. That's believed to be a portrait of him as a young man. And by the way, the big hats are kind of amusing to me, these big black hats, because when you get to the Victorian era, all the women are wearing these big black hats. So it's kind of interesting how the world changes. The one in the bottom right there is in New York, if I'm remembering right, maybe the Frick. I remember observing it as a young student and being overwhelmed by that, just the great sense of color. What really is different about Vermeer, and I'll go back just one more time, what's really different about Vermeer is that he brings a full spectrum. So this idea of color chiaroscuro. So it's not just lost and found. They were already doing, all of them were doing that, the atmosphere in a room and all that sort of stuff. But this guy is bringing the full spectrum, like a level of truth to the color and its relationships to each other, the rightness of its relationships to each other in a way that's never been done before. Virtually everybody else before that was painting out of formulas, which is very characteristic of the Dutch. Of everybody, of long histories. People find somebody's way and they just imitate it. Today we have a lot of guys trying to paint Hudson River School paintings. So let's go further. Again, today everybody knows the pearl earring from the movie, and nevertheless, so he at times, and here again on this big one, this is the Genesis 3:15 allusion, allegory. But there again, you see the big drape hanging in the foreground and this use of an interior in a very similar way. He was working in a place that wasn't a mill. It looked like Gerard Dow was in a mill, like Rembrandt, a windmill type of thing. But you can see this, so it's got an entire interior on the top there. And it's the use of music and the other typical stuff. And I'll get to the subject matter in a second. But these are among the 4 most beautiful pictures that he's well known for. And the top, I believe the top right one also is at the Metropolitan Museum. Things I was able to be fortunate enough to grow up looking at. My methodology when I was a student in terms of studying was to go to the museum. I was going to the Art Students League, and so for those first several years of my education, I would travel to the museum, the Metropolitan Museum, like twice or 3 times a week. And in those days, you could actually get in for a nickel. I remember, as poor as we were as students, it was one of those things that was one of the great blessings. I hope they can keep that mentality going, and I know mostly they have. So. All right, so Otto Grundmann and Baron Leys. Now, Baron Leys was the head of the Antwerp Academy. the Belgian schools that Otto Grundmann studied at. He was the head of that academy. Otto Grundmann, what makes him important? Otto Grundmann was the teacher of Tarbell and Benson. And they are really effectively the top two, the key players in the Boston School, in defining the Boston School. Their development seems to bring everybody else into a similar line. So Otto Grundmann, get that. Now, what you're seeing here, we're going to get into the differences in the way these gentlemen are working, but you'll see already this Baron Leys is coming. He's considered the head of the father or whatever of the new realism of his day. We're in a time like that now where, we're going back to this thing called realism, but it isn't the same thing. And these guys actually were moving away from what we're moving toward now. We'll get into that in a minute. So here's Edmund Tarbell on the left, the top and left. Again, you can see the light either left or right in those two pictures. The window's actually visible, very Vermeer-like. Subject matter, same thing. Frank Benson on the right, again, that atmospheric room, big hanging curtains, still lifes on tables, all stuff that's and many pictures on walls, all that stuff. You're looking at the influence of Vermeer. And by the way, the full color too. And among other things, though, one of the curious things that these guys did, I don't say curious, but I mean one of the policies of the school of the Museum of Fine Arts, headed up by Tarbell, was that when a person succeeded in getting through, by the way, the 7 years of education, they would win a traveling scholarship if they were successful. And one of their jobs was to send back a painting from Europe. They'd have to make a copy and send it back. This was one of the assignments, or one of those suggested that they pick. This is in Antwerp. This is a portrait. This is the original Vermeer on the right. The one on the right is a student copy by a woman named Alice Sawyer. Alice Ruggles Sawyer, I guess. So, you can see that the mentality. I'm not sure, by the way, this picture looks thinner than the other and all that sort of thing. So there's something different about it probably just in the photograph where something had happened. But nevertheless, you can see the acuity with which they're painting. The training is so good that they sit in front of an object in a museum and really do that kind of a careful job. And of course, the school was hoping to actually have these and use these in their world. But that shows the influence as well of Vermeer, that they were actually using his content, his model, what he represented, so much so that they would eventually get students to go over and now copy one of the original. Again, I've already made reference to by bringing this book in. So if you're looking for it online, there it is, Philip Hale, Vermeer. There are two of these, by the way. The second one is not the one you want. It was unauthorized. Vermeer, who was working on a second edition, an upgraded edition, but he died in the midst of it. And any number of things have changed in ways that are actually not, make it not as impressive a book, but it was published. So what you want is the earlier version of it. So let's get back to Paxton, who, as I said, is the most near, and you can see it right in front of you. You almost have trouble deciphering which is a Vermeer. But you can, of course, and again, back to that architectural sense of things. Nothing is more clear than in Vermeer's work than his orderliness. I mean, it's one of those things, we talk about repose as painters, and there's nothing like the need for that in a painting. The feeling of everything being in its place, not overly so, but just so that there's no sense of your eye going wandering, trying to fix things when you're a viewer, a lay viewer. So again, this is the one on the left is called the Pearl Necklace, and I forget what the one on the right is called, but the outside two are Paxton's. The inner two are really well-known Vermeers. Now we're at Joseph de Kamp, and the outer two pictures are by de Kamp. The middle two, again, are by Vermeer. And this is where I like to discuss the movement of color because of that one on the far right there. I'd like to discuss the transitions of color along a wall. One of the experiences I had as a young man was at the MIT Historical Collection, where there was a portrait that, I was looking at the wall of portraits at that collection, and by some pretty impressive painters. And I just looked at it and had a nice time. And I said, I heard there was a de Kamp in here. And I went looking again, and there's this very normal-looking portrait of a middle-aged professor, a guy, And I was stunned by what I saw. First of all, I saw a color movement on the wall going from red above down to getting cooler and cooler and finally being blue. The wall was shifting like that. But that wasn't even the beginning of what blew my mind. It was when I looked again a little closer and I saw that the same color shift was happening through the face, through the actual face of a man being portrayed, which it begins to give you a sense of the sciences involved here. It's a whole different approach. The old style of painting heads was the formula of the head, and to some serious degree, Sargent was still part of that. Sargent was painting a head rather from a formula. Yeah, he was very much more aware of color and all those things. But there's a tendency, these guys really have shifted to painting color notes and making the relationships right of the color notes, so much so that you now have these wall transitioning things that are characteristic. Again, I'm pointing out the leftmost Vermeer. You'll watch the color shift from these cooler notes way into these warm reds, which these photographs don't even begin to show the color shifts, but they're there. It's not just value shifts because the light's more intense on one side and getting darker, which you'll see on the Kamp as well. But just the drift of color, the search. They used to use the word search, and they searching out the magic of the visual impression. Very much what Vermeer himself was doing. Literary critics have praised his interiors for their atmosphere, but practically speaking, there's no atmosphere in an interior. This is an important point because these people aren't self-consciously painting atmosphere. The distance between the foreground and the background is so slight that the intervening air does not modify it at all. What the unwary call atmosphere in an interior is really its coloristic light and shade. It's chromatic light and shade, chiaroscuro. This clair-obscur, as the French translate it, seems to the layman such an obvious condition of things that he hardly realizes how necessary it is for the painter to learn to compare rightly the obscurity of forms in the shadow with their emergence in the halftone and the light. What's so amazing about this quote, and what you'll see in every single one of these people's work, is we're talking about not just the movement of values to create the sense of what Da Vinci referred to as chiaroscuro, but the movement of color through all that. So we'll follow up with a quote that's even maybe more astounding to modern painters. But let me just back you up to Raphael and the previous way of working. Everything previously had been done from carefully drawn outlines of people, as you would say, rather glued in onto the stage, right, of a painting. So you can see how that's happened with the figures on the far right. The main figure has been outlined, drawn, everything modeled up on the inside. Each of the figures sort of glued in, each of them carefully drawn first. We'll see how they do it later, but pasted on, and modeled up. You don't get any sense of depth in this kind of painting. It's remarkable for its lack of a sense of depth. But you don't know that's true. I mean, it has a sense of depth if you would say from as you would call it, from perspective. The foreground figures are bigger, the background figures are smaller. Of course, it's going in that way. Perspective is doing the work for them. But when it comes to the effects of color and light, the lost and found, the clear, obscure, these are the points that are being made now. All of a sudden, this is where the expression goes. Velasquez is referred to by R.E.M. Stevenson in the sense that he says, I'm sorry, it's Paul Valery. I'm really getting it backwards. But he simply says that all of a sudden composition changes. And it really has to do with the introduction of drawing by effects rather than outlines. And you're going to see more of that. And Vermeer is this bridge place for that. And so again, do you see this sense of depth that's wildly different in the way it does it, right? But each of these pictures, as shallow as it is, and that's what Hale alludes to, there's a certain shallowness. It's not, atmosphere you want to believe is what happens when you get 10 miles out, and the sky and the hillside is blue over there, but up here it's got all these high contrast and chromatic differences. But what we're seeing is even in shallow spaces, a great sense of depth, like the middle one, which is a Vermeer. You'll see that great sense of the distant room. That has very much to do with sharpness of edges, just as a part of the discussion. And each of these guys is orienting not just their color and their values in relation to each other, the spots inside the picture, but they're also orienting the effects. So the light effect on the top left one, which is a Benson, of that little bit of newspaper up there, the leading effect in this picture, there's this order of effects that starts changing everything. And that's happening already in the Vermeer, where you see the collar there of that Vermeer. That's the leading effect, or between that and the jug on the left. And then there's these recessive, weaker effects, which is happening, for example, in the lower left one, which is at Kamp, where you see the low contrast in everything in the background. That's more standard, of course, what you get with aerial perspective. But this is characteristic of these guys' ways of working. The one on the bottom right is a Paxton, the one on the top right is a Benson. And again, I'm going back to what was happening right around these guys, our guys. These are up in the upper left. This is Angra. His teacher was David. And of course, history painting was considered to be the be-all and end-all. It was considered the highest form no matter what, which shows you how the influence of subject was dominant at that time. That changes dramatically when you start becoming the kind of painters that Vermeer is, and the influence of the Dutch, of course, was you see the beauty of something sitting in front of you, and now you have a different problem than making up, a history story to tell the story right. I consider these kinds of pictures rather bookish, and I think that they only succeed to the extent that they're visually wonderful, not to the extent they tell the story, which is, I know this is very much in conflict with the modern era and this new realism we're dealing with today. And I didn't mean to say that sarcastically, but I did, I guess. But nevertheless, so the top left, that's Angra doing a painting of Raphael on the Fornarina, his girlfriend. And again, you can see the simple relative flatness of these pictures, everything based on the cutout of objects and the modeling in between those contours. You see the difference? Doesn't it just jump to you, the difference? Now, this lends itself to a more painterly addressing of the art object. The difference is really, really dramatic, isn't it? Now, some people would say that, well, that's more orderly. I mean, the sharper edges and stuff make it feel more clear. And in some sense, that would be true. I think what we're dealing with here to some serious degree is some rather weak reproductions. But nevertheless, the sense of space is what I want you to pick up on, the sense of visual order in the front and back sense. And again, now I'm showing you again, this is one where we're getting to enjoy the floor, the idea of the floor. I'm suggesting to you that is the Vermeer influence. Suddenly you back up in space and you take in the entire room. There's nothing you're afraid of, complexity-wise or any other way, once you become a Boston School painter. When you begin to work from the effects, from the visual impression, and get away from the outline of objects per se. But so this creation of space is just simply a product of the order of visual effects. Well, you can see that in the case of Vermeer, he's still an outline-based guy, but he's moving us in this direction just simply by bringing on more and more of the truth of the visual impression. Significantly, what he makes him different from all the rest, besides his architectonic orderliness, is actually his addressing of color in a full relational setting. Now, this is a close-up. My purpose in doing this one is to give you a much clearer sense of what the underlying magic of this way of working really is created by, okay? So, and I'm talking about the world of lost and found here. I want you to observe just this section here. This shows up 3 or 4 times. This map with this little scrolling end knob here. This thing shows up 3 or 4 times in Vermeer's work as part of a background. What I want you to observe, though, is where the drawing isn't. It's the most curious thing, but it's very much what leads to what the Boston School is doing when it teaches you. By the way, and the only thing I ever learned from the Boston School in terms of what you do first, second, and third is the expression, paint as if you are coming out of a fog. That's the visual order point being made by these guys. There's nothing else linear, like draw the outlines first. Everything was paint as if you were coming out of a fog. And that's pure Boston School, pure visual thinking. Why? Because of the visual order. The visual order drives everything. If you can't draw this shape right here, you can't draw. You certainly can't draw this inside. There's something inside here you can't even see. If you can't draw what you can see, this is the rest of that sort of discussion. If you can't draw what you can see, you can't draw anything. You just can't draw. So learn how to draw. But in the way of talking about the atmospheric and all that sort of thing, if you fail to draw with precision the silhouette that exists, and if you fail to lose with magic and with respect, lose what isn't there. That's the obscure part of the clear, obscure formula, right? And by the way, I know Da Vinci would love this. There's no question Da Vinci she'd say, yeah, that's what I meant. That's exactly where I wanted you to go. I wish I'd thought of that. But he did think of naming, and that's the key to a lot of painting, is make sure you name things. If you really want to get to the next level, you need to name things. So then I spent some time noticing when Vermeer was talking about the blob of the eye, that it wasn't really shapes the way they'd been made. He hadn't drawn around eyelashes and hadn't drawn carefully which by the way Da Vinci would do, carefully the folds of the eyelid, no matter what the lighting was like. He would carefully draw those and then model them up. That's the old model, the outline. In fact, Stevenson refers to that as the primitive way of working. But I want you to observe that this becomes more mass-oriented at this point. And the Boston School talks about spots, blobs. He said, Hale, in this book says, if you're painting a leopard, you're going to paint the spots. You're not going to draw the outline of the leopard. You're going to paint the spots. That's what you see first. Oh, there we are again with that visual order. There's an order of behavior with paintings. If we're coming out, you blur your eye looking at the leopard, or and there you are, you're seeing spots before you see anything else. And this is the orientation of spots. So that would be in the class of what this would represent there. That's a spot. You get that spot in the right place. We're talking about spots, value spots, right? And that's when you begin to see how beautiful these and how important these dots are. This whole thing is a play of dots. That's a distribution of effects. It is a visual dance. So there's nothing, what's not to love? But what really has changed is this, as you get to our generation, as you get past these guys a couple hundred years, is the entire orientation of the Boston School is now to drawing what you see, not drawing what you don't see, or in fact, just drawing the right relationship between how things present. And those things we're talking about now are values, meeting values, and what happens where they meet. Are they sharp edged? Are they lost? So, so there's this beautiful popping of the light caused by the sharpness and the contrast. And then this one here, which is the other side of that, right? There's this big dark, and the other side of this with its beautiful transitions. You can't even hardly see that edge because of the penumbra of the light, the secondary and tertiary shadows coming through the windows, caused by the light coming through the windows. This is very weakened suddenly here. This is strong, that's weak. The bottom edge of this, the top edge is strong, the bottom edge is weak. That's visual order, and that's what's beginning to be seen. These guys are staring at this and thinking, wow, that's too good. I remember seeing that before I knew anything about painting. I thought, that's too much. I'll never be able to do this. I'll never understand. And it really is true. And again, I want to talk about the value unit of the fingers right there. There's a dark blob there. And what they do, what he's working on is getting the light effect right at the leading edge of the bottom finger, losing the other side. It's a value unit. We call that a value unit. So the top side is soft and turning and less visible. The bottom side is where the light is first oriented. And in a place like where the two fingers meet, there's virtually no drawing, right? Because what's really happening there is the first effect is out there at the first finger, the second effect is over here, and before you know it, if you're a typical Boston School person, you realize that you've already won. You don't have to draw every little thing you can make up and see and look deeper and deeper into pictures because you've already got the greater effect, beauty of the big effect. So I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to get to there. Now, let me get back just for a second. I should probably have addressed this earlier, but the genre subject. Now, look, you're painting slices of life. You want somebody to sit in a chair and sit still and stay there for a good long time while you address the beauty of the visual effect of the total package of this thing. So when you saw the Velázquez in the last video, you would have noticed that he was painting casts of thousands, but he's doing the same thing. He's trying to get the relationships of the values of the light effect up here and their edges to some other blob down here, and their sizes and their colors and all those things in relation, and what we call the ensemble. So you typically will pick a subject where you can put the girl down, have her hold the pose, get all the props in place, just like you guys did to me in this setting here. My video guys did to me in this setting here. And so you can actually control that environment, and no different. So the simplicity of the subject matter, well, it naturally lends itself to well, when they say genre, actually, what that term has been used to mean is household settings. just people doing chores around the house, that sort of thing. And that's what's that's characteristic of not just these guys, but as you see, the outside three pictures, these are all Boston School, the genre subject. Here's a woman giving a letter to her mistress, maybe. And in the middle one, that's the Vermeer. Paxton on the left, combing her hair, mirror with Benson on the right, and the far right, I think it's a knitting or sewing activity. Social life, limited setting, and they sit them down and they sit them. The idea is to set them up. Gamble used to say a very interesting thing. My teacher, who was the product of the Boston School, he used to say, you know what? If it isn't there when you start painting, it ain't going to be there when you end the painting. You have to. It's all in the setup. The beauty of your picture is got to be sitting there in front of you now. You can't fix it in the painting. It's characteristic of their thinking. So again, on the far left is Kamp, on the far right is also Kamp. The far right, one of the things I like to show in pictures like this, though, is what began to happen is, and people will start suggesting that this is caused by the sloppiness of Impressionism, but in fact, what starts happening is when these guys start approaching things in the visual order, and when I say visual order now, I'm talking about how visual effects hit your eye. What hits your eye first, what hits it second, and there's an order. And then some things, like you talk about the world of lost and found, the found things hit your eye first, and that whole passage, like on that right to Kamp, that's lost to your eye. You don't see it. But there's an order to all these effects. And there's an order to all the colors and the chromas and the sizes of things as they dance through an entire painting. And what they began to discover when they began to lay in pictures this way is they already had the magic practically before they started. And it wasn't a question of realism in that way anymore. It was a question of aesthetics. Now we're dealing with visual magic for its own sake, and they realized that they were on to something big. Now, I want to tell you what you're addressing there is what makes the Boston School really special. The Boston School is the most aesthetic, and I don't mean just because they do it well, but their orientation is around the aesthetics far more than even those guys, would you believe, in that 19th century era when that was all about the subject. It changes. It's the beauty to the eye. And that's a big shift. This guy, Vermeer, is right at the heart and soul of that. Everything he's doing in the architectonic arrangement, to the color schemes, to the, everything, every aspect of this, the visual order, is because of the way it gratifies the eye. So I'm showing you these as less finished pictures, but so full of the visual magic, entertainment, light entertainment, among other things, right? And so I'm just showing you a few of the pictures. One of the things Vermeer did is close-ups of individuals. Top three are his. And you can see that was one of those things that just follows through. These were all nominal. They weren't particularly portraits of anybody. I don't think in any of these settings they were models for Vermeer. They're models for our guys. So now let's just go on to, again, just a look. The subject in the middle, I'm just picking this because Vermeer takes a picture and he drops the model way low into the picture. He has this big top thing, which is not unusual to the Dutch. But you can see these guys on the far left, Benson again, there's Edmund Tarbell, and then on the right, Paxton. You can see them doing a similar thing. The light, of course, is a big factor. And it was with Vermeer as well, the light, the color of the light, that sort of thing. Again, the sense of Chiaroscuro, the sense of lost and found, the sense of take the far left one where you see the back side of the woman, but her whole face and hands are all lost in that cabinet. What a weird thing to do, right? But what's actually happening is we're watching a pleasing distribution of effects. Now, something happened around the time of Vermeer, and for the first time, I believe, ever in history, the word visual order is used. But that's now shifted from the order composition being about how the subjects were aligned to say what the story was, to now just the dance of light, the dance of color, and the organization of that stuff on a page. Well, Vermeer really was probably the reason that happened. So let's go now. This is just four of our guys, just enjoying some of their stuff. I am here, by the way, I want to say this, to promote the Boston School way of thinking because there's so much magic and it's been missed, it's been overlooked for so long. Hudson River School gets tons of attention and always has, actually. We're probably the first sort of stunning school of thinking, way of thinking. Big landscapes at a time when we were progressing across the country, and so they were doing these vast volcanoes and brilliant sunsets and all that sort of thing. This is a different phase. This is that incorporation of Monet, Vermeer, Velasquez, and various components into a venue actually that fit, and this is something I really probably need to make a point of, that fit a class of people. The Boston School has been accused of being these elitist, wealthy people painting rich girls and happy scenes. They weren't. They were average guys. They could barely afford to go to Europe to study. I mean, they were not these wealthy guys. But the subject that naturally leads to this kind of enjoyment was all over the place. When you're painting the subject you could afford to paint, you couldn't hire casts of thousands. Well, you painted your wives and kids, And so it's very typical and an abuse of these guys that was brought on by competitors and I would say, people who were actually offended by them politically, totally wrong in their thinking. So these are just logical subject matters that fit the times and literally the finances of these guys. However, what I want you to observe is there's entertaining use of light, the play of shape and color, the dance. It's all backward. We're becoming more and more and more visual. And I really do enjoy these decamps in relation to the Vermeers. This one I picked only because there's 4 musical instruments. There's the guitar I guess that's a lute or guitar there, and then the violin on the far right. The outside 2 are by Joseph de Kamp, the middle 2 by Vermeer. You get the sense that they're living in the same mindset, don't you? It's about the light. Yeah, the aesthetic side of it is when you're painting pictures, it's not unusual for you to bring a beautiful thing into the room, like a woman, or better yet, a woman in a beautiful dress, or even better yet, with a beautiful instrument. And nice things around the backgrounds and whatever. I mean, it's all an aesthetic orientation toward pleasing the eye, toward better things, toward the elevation of the mind. So this is probably the key moment here. Just we're breaking these in just because we've got to get back to being more than just showing pictures. The reason Vermeer made his drawing so just, his values so true, was because he cared so much about color. Now, this is probably the most staggering thing, and that thing is unknown today in a world where we've gone back to drawing outlines and noodling the form, local color. This is one of the most remarkable things that's been said probably in the history of painting. The reason Vermeer made his drawing so just, his value so true, was because he cared so much about color. Whoa, is that logical even? His drawing in his best things came right because the chiaroscuro, the edges, and the color were rightly observed. He loved light and shade, he was a master of it, and the only way he could render its beauty as he saw it was by getting his drawing and his subtle color shifts just right. Vermeer then did not strive to paint right because 'tis naughty to do wrong, but because the infinitely beautiful subtleties of light he saw about him could not really be rendered without true drawing and color. This is the shift. This is that thing that makes everything change. So here I am in this, and showing these close-ups. I'm circling them, but the left picture is where Hale was speaking in the book about suddenly seeing that seamstress by Vermeer hadn't had a linearly drawn eye. It was a blob, just a blob of values. I'm looking at this spot right here. So there's a dark blob that wanders off and goes that way. But it has a soft edge over here, a sharper edge with a stronger light effect here, and does that variation on the edges all the way through it, and is, by that means, an eye. Wildly different from lessons on how to draw the eye, how to draw the human eye. The same thing is true of the finger masses. Now, what you can easily see looking at these fingers and comparing the Edmund Tarbell in the middle or the Benson on the far right, I mean, I've brought them up close. I mean, like, is that... Now, again, I'm going to say to you that this has got outlines on it because he was of that education. But the shift is dramatic. And our guys are picking up on this and saying, you know what, he's actually not drawing the way they used to. And these guys over and say, well, then how would you be drawing? But they realized what he was up to. He was drawing effects, and he was drawing in the visual order, and he was drawing value masses and what happens at their edges, which is the clear and obscure discussion. He's talking about effects. Now, he because of the timing, because the world he was coming out of was coming in through the back door. When you get to these guys, that's what they do. Everything is about spots of color and the effects that are made by the differentiation of edges. So you can see the little finger on the far right figure, or even the middle finger, just a smear of light. And some people would say he can't draw. Well, when you back up and see that, and let's do that, when you back up and see that, there is not a thing wrong. It's absolutely beautiful. It's absolutely all it needs to be a beautiful hand, unless your dedication is to something else, right? And that's a big question, and it's a big question for everybody going forward. One of the reasons I want to talk about this is because we're in a time of renovation of representational painting, what some people call realism. And I'm going to suggest to the student out there who may be listening to this, that if you don't understand this, you're way behind the times. You're living in the past in the worst kind of a way. There's something about this that you have to understand to just be equal with the men of the times just preceding us. And if Gamel's right, you really only have access to the guys just preceding you. You really don't have access to the guys way before. You don't know what they were doing. Gamel used to constantly opine and complain about what we didn't know about the guys painting the way he really wanted to paint. So there you are. It's about effect. So you see that left hand in the middle picture, this is the Tarbell. You could see the emphasis on a strange pattern and color movement within this strange pattern and it is the hand. It isn't outlines of fingers anymore, right? I recommend you go back to look at the old, there, I bring up the eye on the right. I forgot I'd done this. Again, now this is one that discusses his way of approaching painting, but if you're looking at the far, this is all Vermeer's pictures. The one on the right is the eye that I was just referring to, where you can see it as a close-up. That's where Hale is saying, we looked at this and we said, what? That isn't how you draw an eye. This is something different. We're talking about value masses now. Things are changing. You're becoming more visual. Things don't present as outlines of objects. I mean, anybody looking even at me in this setting, you'll see parts of me disappearing. And if you were to cut me out with an outline, I would look totally weird in front of this. I wouldn't look like I was spatially right. That's the educated eye after having experienced the Boston School and the rest of Impressionism that feeds right out of Vermeer and right out of Velázquez. So if you look at the girl on the far left, the head of the young woman there, look at these passages where you couldn't find where the hair shifted into the neck if you wanted to. Folks, that's what we call atmosphere. That's that place, the purpose of that area, as they would say, and this is thanks to the Vermeer education, is to create atmosphere. And what people don't realize, the new realists have a hard time with. A lot of young people do. I mean, and I don't blame. It's just a timing thing. You got to grow past where you are. But what you're going to miss is that there are areas of paintings that are designed to set off other areas. So the high contrast, busy areas, that's the clear part of the clear obscure. The obscure part is sitting there to give these guys a place to play, almost like the chorus, in a Greek play. It's got a job to do to set the stage, and then this person comes up and performs, right? So this is what's actually happening. So it's very important that you don't have performances everywhere. You want to limit them. So this, in the sense of visual order, this and that. Do you see how these two are the primary focuses of the visual effect in this site? If that was all we had for a picture. Now, this is a development from that. That cutout there is way, way less than this one, where you're still feeling like he's pasted onto outlines. But all of a sudden, you get this dedication. I mean, just look at the sheer amount look at her nose turning into the wall. I mean, what is that green stuff? I mean, you could say other things about that. I'm not trying to be funny, but I mean, like that is silly, right? That can't be done. Where's her nose? So many things start shifting. And that's one of those things. So here's the top of her hairband disappearing into the background. You see that? And when that happens, now we're beginning to see the Boston School guys are beginning to say, oh, let's see. That means you paint as if you were coming out of a fog. Let's try that. Paint as if what would you paint first, second, and third? That's the visual order. So you blur your eyes down. And anybody looking at me up here, if you blur your eyes down really well, you can look at me and you'll say, oh, I see this part of his hand or his head, but I don't see that's lost in the background. Oh, right? Now you're starting to talk about what the Boston School is really up to, and it's this kind of a person between him and Velázquez where you're realizing what they're being led by. Again, I want you to look at this blob here. I'm going to call this a blob because in the same sense as that eye over there, this is a value blob. If you blur your eye a little bit, you'll see that the value's got to maintain its kind of a unity with itself, right? But notice how even within this blob here, there's a visual punch right there, right? Well, that's not the same thing as drawing eyes and getting shapes. So you can't do all these things at once. The best these guys have found, the Boston School guys, by the time you get to the Boston School, they've realized that the best way to render truth in front of you, and that focus was created by setting up things and just painting what you see. the best way to render it was not outlines. That's a very inefficient means. And it got you problems. It wrecked the visual impression, but it didn't convey as much stuff about the data, about depth. I mean, isn't it interesting that you can actually feel the distance between this wall and her face? You can feel it just sitting there, can't you? From back a ways. You can feel he's created this distance. If I put outlines around everything, that distance would disappear. And that's what we're talking about. This discussion of the middle two pictures is how he may have laid in pictures. Even here you can see mass blobs, blob, blob, blob. But you'll notice that there's a leading edge on them. And like on this leg here, there's a sharper edge and there's a turning edge. The turning edge is less visible typically, right? So this is a leading edge, that's a turning edge. That's the order of the edges. That's the order of the effects. The edge is a big factor. People don't realize that. So that's true of all these backgrounds. These are just paintings that were in the background of other pictures where you can begin to see how he may have himself laid in a painting. I'm doing this one actually just because I wanted to show you a little more color, a little more partying. This picture on the left, this Vermeer, is one of the most stunning things in the history of art, period. And it is one of those things you say, I don't disagree with Hale when you say this guy probably is the guy. You look at him and you think, I got to have all those things if I'm going to be a successful painter. This ability to organize a painting, not just architecturally, but to organize it by color. Have this dominance of one color and this distribution that follows that. I love the one on the right, though. This is the Kamp. Where is that? In Cincinnati, I think. No, it's not Cincinnati. It's somewhere in the South, though. But it's a absolute tour de force in color, and it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the Vermeer open up the color scheme. I mean, I say it couldn't have happened. Obviously, it could have, but it's certainly that focus. Everybody saw Vermeer. By the way, Vermeer hadn't been seen much before that. It's an interesting point. Vermeer was virtually invisible forever. Philip Hale is one of the reasons people started looking at him. So I don't know what exactly happened at that time, but he had disappeared for, just like Velázquez, for some seriously long time. And when he shows up again, I mean, this book was a major factor in popularizing his way of thinking, and of course the times were right for it, especially because everybody, once the wealthy churches and state and all that stuff started paying for pictures, all of a sudden people had to fall back on their own resources, which means they had to look outside and paint a landscape. They had to look at their wife in the chair and say, turn a little bit and I'm going to paint. I mean, they literally were brought into this world of painting the subject in front of them. And we call it Impressionism, because it's painting the visual impression. You begin to realize that the way of painting the visual impression is not based on the outline of subjects. So let me, this is a little bit overwhelming. I think we may be ending on this one. But the man who modestly tries to make the drawing, this is probably the most earth-shifting. I love this picture. Gemmell himself painted a painting of a young man standing in a world. He was sort of hanging on like this because the ground he was standing on had shifted and the pillars were shaking and all of his foundations were going sideways. I'd swear that this is what happens when you get to what happened in the 19th century, that everybody thought it was outlines and all of a sudden the ground shifted because it wasn't about outlines anymore. It was about the whole thing. It was about the big impression, about the big picture. So this is a summary of what we're talking about here. And this is one of the great statements. The man who modestly, Philip Hale again, the man who modestly tries to make the drawing, the values, and the color is apt. That means he's good if he has the ability to do all three well, okay? You can't get really accurate model drawing without true color. Would you believe? This is new thinking. Indeed, if by some miracle one were able to paint each color right in tone, shape, and shift, the drawing would come by itself, and so it does. If you put yourself to this task, you'll find so it does. And so with light and shade and tone values or relations, there are simply other names for color. The truest drawing is a melange of light and shade. The moment a man searches one quality for itself alone, he does, by that very act, strip it of some of its most important attributes. We too often forget that all things are made manifest to us through the action of light. Light and shade cannot truly be rendered unless it includes color and form. Form, as it appears to us, cannot be rightly indicated without the aid of color and chiaroscuro. That's the lost and found discussion. Color, true color, can't be well suggested unless the shapes are right and the modulation. In other words, the drawing and the values. I like to end this with a statement. When I was a young man, we were handed by Gemmell this one line. He said, drawing is everything. And I would argue that drawing is everything, but not the way they meant it. They had another phrase that said, well drawn is well enough colored. classic 19th century pre-Impressionism thinking. Well drawn is well enough colored? Well, let me tell you what, I agree with the drawing is everything. What that actually means is drawing is color, drawing is chroma, drawing is size, drawing is edge, drawing is shape. It's not what it used to be. It used to be just the outline around an object and the form in between those two contours. Drawing is actually the composite, everything working together simultaneously, and it changes entirely the way one paints. Thank you very much.